Imagine being trapped in a snowstorm, in an isolated place where the winds cut through and the silence is more terrifying than any sound. Now imagine you're not alone, and what lurks in the shadows is not human. In today's video, we'll dive into 3 true horror stories so disturbing, you'll think twice before stepping out into the snow. Get ready, because these winter tales are more than just nightmares. They're warnings. Welcome to Echoes of Fear. It was a cold January night in Winterport, a small town in the state of Maine, where winter seemed like an eternal visitor. The snow fell incessantly, covering everything in a thick, immaculate layer. The trees, now leafless, were bent under the weight of the snow, and the houses were surrounded by mounds of ice that seemed to grow with each passing minute. The wind sliced through the night, howling down the empty streets, making the cold penetrate to the bone. Winterport felt like a town in deep slumber, swallowed by the storm. On the outskirts of town, on Maple Street, there was an old, dark house, known to the locals as the Holloway House. It sat at the end of the street, isolated by large trees that, at that hour of night, stood like threatening shadows. The house looked even more haunted in winter, with broken windows and the front door always creaking, as if calling someone to enter. It was a large, imposing building, though weathered with time, as if it refused to be consumed by abandonment. The story of the Holloway House dated back to the 1920s, when the Holloway family moved to Winterport. The family consisted of patriarch Charles Holloway, a stern and reclusive man, his wife Eliza, who suffered from a mysterious and debilitating illness, and their daughter Margaret, a young woman with peculiar beauty and eccentric behavior. The Holloways quickly isolated themselves from the other townspeople, preferring the solitude of the mountains and the silence of the snow-covered fields. The town soon began to notice the peculiarities of the family. Charles, in particular, seemed obsessed with something no one could understand. He would spend hours in his study, poring over old books, making notes in notebooks that no one ever dared to look at. Suspicion about him spread. Some said he was involved in occult practices. Others spoke of an obsession with ancient artifacts and rituals. Eliza rarely left the house, and Margaret, the daughter, was only seen on particularly cold days, with a distant, strange look in her eyes. Over time, the townspeople began to avoid the Holloway house. The dusty windows and closed curtains gave the impression that no one there wanted to be found. It was a house of mystery, surrounded by untold stories. The last time the Holloway family was seen was during a particularly harsh winter night in 1931. After that, no one ever knew what happened to them. The house stood empty, but the legend that something terrible had happened there persisted. Ethan, a local history student, had always been fascinated by the old legends of Winterport. He would spend hours at the town library, reading about the Holloway family and the history of the house. His interest grew over the months until one night he decided to investigate for himself. The town was covered by a particularly strong blizzard, and most of the townspeople were home, warming themselves by their fireplaces. It was the perfect night to venture out to the Holloway house. With his wool coat wrapped tightly around his body and a lantern in hand, Ethan crossed the deserted streets of Winterport, his steps muffled by the thick layer of snow. The wind howled fiercely, but he pressed on, determined. The town seemed quieter than usual, as if it were waiting for something. He reached Maple Street, where the tall, twisted trees formed a natural maze, almost as if they were trying to swallow anyone who tried to pass. The Holloway house stood before him, imposing and solitary. The roof was covered by a thick layer of snow. The broken windows seemed like empty eyes, and the front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting Ethan to enter. He hesitated for a moment, a feeling of unease creeping over him, but curiosity was stronger. He pushed the door with a slight pressure, which creaked open as if expecting him. Upon entering, the cold, heavy air immediately enveloped him. The smell of old wood and mold filled his nostrils. The house was strangely silent, but at the same time, it felt as though someone was there, watching him. Ethan pointed his lantern at the corners of the room, illuminating faded tapestries and furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. The floor creaked beneath his feet with every step he took. He explored the first floor, going room by room, but found nothing particularly interesting, except for a growing sense of discomfort. It wasn't until he climbed to the second floor that something truly strange happened. In the hallway, he came upon an old portrait hanging on the wall. It was a painting of Margaret Holloway, the daughter of the family, depicted in an elaborate gown. Her eyes, though painted with precision and elegance, seemed alive, as if the young woman were watching Ethan's every move. He froze for a moment, as if the eyes in the painting had entranced him. There was something hypnotic about the way she looked at him, a deep emptiness in her gaze. Suddenly, a loud noise from downstairs snapped him back to reality. The sound was so intense that the house seemed to tremble. Ethan quickly turned, his heart racing. He heard slow footsteps descending the stairs. He hurried to go downstairs as well, but when he reached the main room, the atmosphere had completely changed. The cold seemed to intensify, the air denser, as though the house itself were alive, breathing. Ethan looked around, feeling a chill run down his spine. Then he heard a voice. Low and whispering, it seemed to come from the walls, as if echoing through the very building. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan's blood froze. He turned quickly, searching for anyone, but there was no one. The only sound now was the wind battering against the broken windows, mixed with the sound of something else, as if something were moving in the shadows. His lantern trembled in his hands, the light flickering erratically. That's when he heard the sound of heavy footsteps, as if someone was approaching. He raised the lantern and saw a figure on the stairs. It was a woman, dressed in a long white gown, her black hair cascading heavily over her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on Ethan, but there was no emotion in them, only a deep emptiness, a gaze that froze the soul. She stood motionless at the top of the stairs, watching him in silence. "You came in," the woman said in an icy voice. "Now you can't leave." Ethan tried to run, but the environment around him began to distort. The walls seemed to close in, the air grew heavier, and the cold became unbearable. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. The house wouldn't let him leave. As he struggled to escape, he heard something behind him. He turned, and at the end of the hall, saw Margaret Holloway's eyes in the portrait. Now, the smile she once had was even more pronounced, and her eyes, now, were alive, glowing in a supernatural way, as if they were calling to him. "Welcome to our house," whispered the figure on the stairs. The last thing Ethan saw was Margaret's smile widening, as if the house had finally swallowed him whole. The next day, the blizzard had passed. When the rescuers arrived at the Holloway house, they found no sign of Ethan. The house was silent, as always, but there was a sense that something was wrong. The portrait of Margaret Holloway, which had previously seemed blurry and distant, now appeared more vivid than ever. Her eyes were fixed on the window, watching what was happening outside. Winterport now kept its distance from the Holloway house. Some said that on winter nights, if you ventured too close, you could hear the footsteps of Margaret Holloway in the snow. Others claimed to hear laughter and whispers in the wind, coming from within the house, but no one ever dared to get too close again. The Holloway house was waiting, just as it always had, and it would never let anyone leave. Now, for those who still have the courage, let's begin the second story. I want to thank each and every one of you who is here. I've really enjoyed being a part of this. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Let's go. It was a cold December night in Silverthorne, Colorado. The small town, known for its proximity to the mountains and ski slopes, was covered by a thick layer of snow. The biting wind howled through the deserted streets, and the lights in the houses flickered weakly, struggling against the storm's strength. The roads were nearly deserted, and the few cars still driving seemed to be powered by a force of survival, their weak headlights cutting through the darkness. The sky was completely overcast, without a star in sight, as if the sky itself was being swallowed by the storm. Mark, a 35-year-old man, had just moved to Silverthorne with his wife, Julia, and their son, Lucas. They had moved from Denver in search of more peace, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The move seemed promising at first, but over time, an uncomfortable feeling began to creep in. Silverthorne, with its tranquil streets and cozy houses, had a strange stillness to it, as if the town was hiding secrets it didn't want discovered. Something didn't feel right there, and the snow, which had initially brought charm to the place, now felt like a heavy cloak of silence. Mark worked as a freelance photographer, and with the ski season in full swing, he was home that night, catching up on editing photos and finishing up some work. Julia had gone shopping in a nearby town, and Lucas was in his room, busy with drawings. The storm had been intensifying since late afternoon, but Mark wasn't worried. They had already grown accustomed to the mountain winters, and he knew he wouldn't see much activity at this time of year. At 9 p.m., while he was looking out the window from the living room, Mark noticed that the snow was falling more heavily. The white layer was accumulating rapidly on the deserted streets, and the muffled sound of the storm seemed to swallow all other noises of the town. It was as if the very town was being consumed by the storm, becoming more distant with each passing minute. He leaned back on the couch, sighing in relief for being home, sheltered from the cold. But then, a sudden noise from the front door slamming shut made Mark jump off the couch. He looked toward the entrance, but no one was there. The strong wind must have blown the door open, and he got up to close it. Something, however, made him hesitate for a moment. He glanced quickly around the room, and for a second, he had the eerie feeling that he was being watched. He tried to shake it off, but something didn't feel right. The house felt too cold, the air thick with an unnatural quiet. He shut the door and checked that it was properly locked, but the unease lingered. Something in his mind was telling him that something was off, something visceral that he couldn't quite put his finger on. It must just be the storm, he thought. He decided to go to the kitchen and make some hot tea to warm up and try to relax. But as he walked through the house, a shadow, or rather a dark figure, caught his attention outside the kitchen window. He stopped, motionless for a moment. Outside, amidst the storm, there was a figure dressed in heavy clothing, with a hood covering their head and large boots sinking into the snow. The figure was moving quickly, as if it had a purpose, and it was heading toward the entrance of his house. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He edged closer to the window to try to see better, but the snow was falling so heavily that it made visibility difficult. Even so, he could clearly see that the figure was coming straight toward his house. His heart raced, and instinctively he pulled away from the window, stepping back into the living room. The silence in the house felt amplified. Mark rushed to the phone and tried to call Julia, but before he could press the call button, the line was cut. Confused, he tried again, but the signal failed once more. He tried calling a friend, but the same happened. The phone had no signal, as if the storm were draining all the energy around them. The figure in the street seemed closer now. The sound of the wind made it almost inaudible, but Mark knew the figure was still there, standing in front of his house. He went to the window near the door and once again tried to peek through the curtain, but the figure had vanished, gone into the shadows of the storm as though it had never been there. Mark exhaled in relief, but the unease refused to leave. He decided to go upstairs where Lucas was. When he reached his son's bedroom door, he paused, feeling a strange weight in the air. The door was slightly ajar, but there was no sound coming from inside. He slowly pushed the door open, calling out Lucas's name. "Lucas, are you awake?" But there was no answer. The room was empty, but the bed was perfectly made, as if no one had lain in it. Mark's heart raced. He looked at the window and saw the curtain fluttering gently. The wind, though strong downstairs, seemed insufficient to make it move like that. The window was open. At the moment Mark went to close it, he looked out at the street, and then he saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure he had seen earlier was now in the street, closer to the house. But this time, it wasn't alone. There was another person with it, also dressed in heavy clothing. And between them was Lucas. The boy stood motionless, as if hypnotized, staring at the figures with an empty expression. Mark felt an uncontrollable wave of panic. He ran to the front door, flung it open with force, but the wind hit him immediately, nearly knocking him over. He shouted Lucas's name, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. The street was empty. There was no one there. He searched around, but all he could see were snowflakes blowing against the streetlights. Desperate, he ran to the car and drove down the only road that led to the nearby town where Julia was. The path was covered in snow and ice, and the car skidded, but he didn't care. He sped up, with fear weighing heavily on his chest. With each kilometer, the storm worsened, making it harder to see ahead. When Mark finally reached the neighboring town, he stopped in front of the store where Julia was. He ran inside, still trying to call the police, but there was no signal. Inside the store, Julia was alone, as if time had stopped. When she saw him, she seemed surprised. "Mark, what are you doing here? What happened?" she asked, sounding confused. "Where's Lucas?" Mark asked, his throat tight. "Lucas is at home, dear, sleeping. You didn't call to check?" Julia replied, puzzled, not understanding what was happening. Mark felt the ground fall out from under him. He stood frozen, trying to comprehend what was going on. But he knew that something very strange was happening in Silverthorn. He was with me. He was out there with those people. "Julia, you don't understand," Mark said, his voice shaking. "We have to go home now." Back at home, Julia still seemed incredulous, but Mark's panic forced her to get in the car. When they arrived, the house seemed too quiet. The door was open, but there was no sign of Lucas. Mark rushed through the house, searching every corner, but he didn't find him. Then he looked out the window and through the storm saw the dark figure again, hooded and with large boots, standing outside. But now there was something more. The figure looked directly at Mark, with dark, deep eyes that seemed to see straight through him. It was the same figure, but its eyes, which had previously seemed empty, were now filled with an immense darkness, something beyond human understanding. Mark knew at that moment that Silverthorn was hiding something far worse than the cold winter, and at that instant he knew he would never escape. Take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, drink some water. And now, let's move on to the last story. Don't forget to support the channel. Estes Park, Colorado, a small mountain town, was famous for its proximity to the Rocky Mountain National Park. During the winter, the town transformed into a fairy tale setting, with its quiet streets covered in snow and the towering mountains surrounding the town. However, that night in February, the snow did not bring the usual sense of peace. The storm was different, heavier, more relentless, as if nature itself was trying to swallow the entire town. Sarah, a 28-year-old writer, had recently moved from Denver to Estes Park, seeking peace and inspiration for her new novel. She rented a house isolated on 4th Street near the park entrance, where the mountains always seemed to watch over her with their silent presence. Since her arrival, she had begun writing about the place and soon found herself captivated by a local story of a mysterious disappearance that occurred more than 40 years ago. Henry Blackwell, a man who lived alone in the mountains, had disappeared on a night like this during an intense snowstorm. The police never found a clue as to what had happened. Some believed he was taken by the mountains. Others said he ran away to start a new life. But what intrigued Sarah the most was that some locals still whispered about the disappearance as if it were an unresolved mystery, something incomplete hanging over the town. That night, the snow fell heavily, and Sarah was in her living room, sitting at the dining table trying to write. But the words simply wouldn't come. The story of Henry Blackwell was stuck in her mind, but she couldn't find a way to tell it. The wind howled against the windows, and the storm had been intensifying throughout the day, now becoming nearly deafening. It was when, amidst the heavy silence of the house, that she heard the first knock at the door. Sarah immediately stood up, looking at the clock. It was nearly 11 p.m. Who could be at her door in the middle of such a strong storm? Hesitant, she walked over to the window and peeked through the curtain. There was no one outside, only the snow falling in spirals, obscuring the view of the street. Perplexed, she closed the curtains and took a step back. But then another knock, this time louder and faster. Sarah froze. The door. She felt a strange sensation, a feeling that made her question her own perception of reality. She looked at the nearest window again, trying to see the street. But the snow was so thick that visibility was nearly zero. She decided that if something or someone was out there, she should take a step back and check from another angle. She grabbed the house's landline phone to try and call a friend, but before she could dial, the line was cut. The silence was complete. Then, the phone rang again, and when she answered, all she heard was heavy breathing. Before she could respond, the line dropped again. Now, Sarah was on high alert. Who was trying to communicate with her? And why was there this tension in the air? The snow outside didn't help. The wind made the house creak, and the shadows seemed to come alive on the walls. Determined to figure out what was happening, Sarah approached the kitchen window and peered out again, trying to see the street. That's when she saw him for the first time. A silhouette, standing in the middle of the street, staring directly at her house. A man. He was dressed in a dark coat and a hat, the features of his face obscured by the darkness and the snow haze. Sarah's heart raced. The figure stood still, watching as if waiting for something. Unsure of what to do, she backed away from the window and went toward the back door, intending to leave discreetly. Perhaps if she could make it to the town center, she would find help. The streets were empty, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly, making everything more frightening. She got in her car and started the engine, but the vehicle hesitated, as if it too were reluctant to venture out into the storm. Each meter she drove, the fear increased. The wind hit the glass, and visibility was nearly non-existent, but Sarah couldn't stop. All she wanted now was to get away from it all. She followed Highway 34, which connected Estes Park to the town center, but when she made a sharp turn, her car skidded and almost went off the road. She stopped quickly, but when she looked out the window, she saw the man again. He was standing at the side of the road, still staring at her. The sense of panic intensified. How was he there? How had he gotten there? Sarah accelerated the car, ignoring any rational thoughts, but before she could drive further, the man disappeared. He vanished into the shadows of the storm without leaving a trace. She stopped for a moment, trying to regain her composure. But something in her mind warned her. He hadn't simply disappeared. Something more was going on. She decided to continue, finally reaching the town center. The police station was only a few blocks away, and she knew she would find someone there who could help. But when she reached the street where the station was located, she encountered a strange scene. The lights were out, the doors locked. The town seemed deserted, as if all the people had vanished into the storm. It was as though the town had been swallowed by the snow. She got out of the car, feeling the sharp cold, and looked around. The street was empty. The sound of the wind was the only noise. She turned around, and that's when she heard footsteps. Someone was approaching her, leaving tracks in the snow. Sarah quickly turned, but saw no one. Just the emptiness of the night and the sound of the storm. But as she started to walk back to the car, she heard the voice. A hoarse voice, as if it was coming from far away. "He's back." The voice seemed to spread through the air, echoing through the mountains around her, and she froze. The voice was clear, but no one was near. It was as if she were hearing something from a forgotten memory, an echo from the past. Sarah's heart began to beat hard in her chest. She looked toward the town center at the closed police station and finally realized what was happening. The disappearance of Henry Blackwell, the story she had been investigating for the past few days, had something to do with this. He had disappeared on a night like this, just like she was living now. And somehow, his story was still alive, haunting the town. And she was more connected to this mystery than she had ever imagined. She quickly returned to the car, and when she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw the figure again. He was standing in the street, staring at her. This time, she didn't dare to stop. She put the car in motion and sped away, quickly leaving the town behind. The cold enveloped her, but something colder, darker, was with her now. As the road back to her house stretched before her, Sarah knew that Estes Park, with its secrets buried in the snow, would never be the same for her. And the mystery of Henry Blackwell would follow her, no matter how far she tried to run. Well, everyone, we've come to the end of another terrifying video here on Echoes of Fear. I want to thank all of you who stuck around until the end. I hope these winter horror stories gave you that chill down your spine. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming spooky stories. And, of course, share it with your friends. Or maybe with those you'd like to scare. Until next time, and remember, fear never stops echoing.